And what were the things that made it shift? So we got the long run aggregate supply. What were the things that made it shift? Quantity of capital, good. So real capital, more machines, more buildings, more factories, more whatever. Okay, good. What else? Land, labor. So land, labor, capital, all of those things. We might even throw entrepreneurship in there, but we didn't at the time. We were thinking more quantity of physical things. But all of the resources of the economy to help it expand. And where was this thing anchored? What did we put here? Potential, good. So that represented the potential for the economy, given our available resource base, how much stuff can we make? And I related it back to the production possibilities frontier, that the economy can be at different points along the frontier, but there's only so much we can do. It's impossible to do something with nothing. And this vertical relationship with inflation meant what? Meant what? No relationship, right. So having that vertical, it doesn't really matter if the price of a computer is $2,000 or $20,000. As long as your income, doesn't matter if you're making $20,000 or $200,000. As long as your income stays up with the prices, really it doesn't matter, right? So prices don't matter in a sense in the economy in the long run. With a healthy market system of price flexibility, prices are just going to adjust to relative scarcities of the final goods and relative scarcities of the resources. And so price flexibility is kind of the key to give us this conclusion. At the end of the day, the amount of stuff we can make depends on the quantity of real resources available. All right, so the short run aggregate supply says that maybe there is a trade-off. So the aggregate supply curve, I think this textbook just uses AS. I'm trying to just follow, this isn't the notation I used in principles class. So I'll try to, if I put something different up there, you can feel free to call me out on it. I'm just trying to stay consistent with the text, even though I normally put SAS and LAS. So potential trade-off for the economy between output and inflation, which is completely contrary to what we just said, that there is no trade-off. So how do we get a short-run trade-off between prices and output? It's basically saying if there is some inflation, then yeah, I guess I lied, we can have some more output. The sticky wages, good. And I actually don't think the textbook does a great, I'm kind of beating them up on this chapter, but I don't think they do a great job of telling that story. They, in terms of the lag time of maybe resource price adjustment versus output price adjustment. Because that's really the heart of the story is how these prices adjust. If all prices adjust fairly quickly, what classical economists would call full price flexibility, then this would be the relationship. If we instead tell a story of stickiness in the wage rates, what does that mean? What does stickiness mean?
It means that it's, for some reason I'm thinking of it in physics terms, like it has a high inertia, so to speak, it's slower to move.
Okay. Who else wants to add into that? Slower to move, I'd buy that. That's kind of the idea. So maybe slower to move than what? Than output prices? Okay, maybe. Who else wants to add? Sticky wages. We've talked about it at different points during the textbook, or sticky resource prices, but usually we kind of think about wages.
Prices that aren't necessarily something that's kind of stuck in time. And
Yeah, and why? Yeah, so why is
You
it
should-
stuck?
you should be earning $90, but you're making $7.25.
Okay, good, good. That's the right idea. And so why does it? I just kind of want to give a little bit of gut feeling that this is an okay assumption.
So the idea is that when inflation goes up, you can buy less at the store with your money. So wages should go up accordingly and adjust for that, but they take a little bit longer to do that, and they tend not to want to.
Okay, good. So we're adding nice little things here as we go. So why would we expect wages to be potentially sticky, less inertia, not kind of stuck?
Because employers only do wage hikes every now and then versus when they should.
Yeah, and so why is that? So why is sticky? So employers only give pay raises, what did you say, Michael? Infrequently, kind of, or?
Sure.
So somebody add on to that from Michael. Somebody other than Michael add on to that. Why?
Because as an employer, you don't want to hike up the wages with such uncertainty of what's going to happen.
Okay, good, good. So, employers maybe face greater uncertainty with their business. Okay, good comment. I think we can add a few more onto this too to kind of motivate that. What else?
I think it's because, adding on to that, I think it's because the long run, the supply curve, when it doesn't shift yet, so when they have a quick shift in the supply and demand curve, it could potentially come back. Because
Okay.
A lot of times we said that the supply curve is gonna end up shifting back to the long run.
Okay, good, good. And
Back up and then,
so what about coming back that employers would be reluctant because they face uncertainty with their business and they would rather do it a little more infrequently and be a little more sure, because if it goes back,
they don't wanna cut someone's paycheck.
there's a reluctance to cut, right? So we like to give pay raises, but due to maybe cultural reasons or whatever, we might decrease morale, or employees just don't like the idea of getting a cut in their paycheck. So we kind of have this ratcheting up that's okay because there's a reluctance to come down. So in a flexible market, that might be going up and down. Business is good, I raise pay. Business is down, I cut your pay. That doesn't work so hot in our culture, right? Part of that's just kind of cultural. All right, good. So employers face greater uncertainty with their business. They are reluctant to cut pay when business is down. So in short, it's kind of easy up, but hard to cut. Okay, all of those are kind of Keynesian arguments to some stickiness in the labor market. We haven't even touched on kind of another thing that could happen. So this is kind of I'd say this is a free market response, is that you've got two parties, employers, this kind of employer-employee relationship is such that we want to reward our good workers and reward them when times are good, and what's a response to that, by the way? Let me, before I go my other direction, what's an employer's response to this? When times are good, they want to reward their employees, but then they're kind of reluctant to want to give them a pay cut. So what are some adaptations that are made in the labor market to accommodate for that? They give them a bonus, good, right? So we structure it a little bit differently. We're saying, hey, times are good, here's a $500 check. You're still making $10 an hour, but here's a $500 check, right? So that's a different way, giving bonuses. Then in the employee's mind, they know that that's temporary. So that would be the classical economist rebuttal back to this Keynesian argument. Would say, oh, come on, in the real world labor market, they're not sticky. They're going to keep it down, but they're just going to give them bonuses or whatever, and then we still have resource price flexibility through other mechanisms like that. Okay, so what's another thing? For this one, we might even think about other resources like your space that you operate out of, your business space. So we could stick to labor too on this, but I think it's easy to think about the amount of money you pay for your space. How do a lot of businesses operate? Do they own their space or rent it?
Rent it or lease it.
They rent it or lease it. And how are those contracts set up? Are they year to year like your guys' residential leases? No. And a lot of you might not know that, but commercial leases are a lot of times almost minimum 3 year, unless you're running a little thing out of Main Street. Like if I own a couple shops out on Ottawa Main Street, those very well could be month to month or 1 year leases. But you start getting into the South Ottawa area of McDonald's and some of those bigger places, Sterling Stockade, they're probably renting that space, that land. Sometimes you even do a land lease, and McDonald's might build a building on the land, and all they're doing is leasing the land, and then they spend $1 million, $2 million on building a building on the land because they have a 99-year lease. That's the maximum length of a lease by law. So you can have long-term leases in commercial contracts. And so whether it's a fixed monthly rent of $2,000 a month or $10,000 a month if you're in a big warehouse facility or whatever it is, those contracts are pretty fixed. And the one that I was thinking about with labor are labor contracts. If you're working with unions, then you might have a 3-5 year contract with pay. We've negotiated out that the union rate's going to be $17.50 an hour, and that's what it's going to be for the next 5 years. And so we have a labor contract in place that might cause there to be stickiness in the labor market. All right, so that's a couple other areas. There could be why are wages sticky? I guess if we want to call this number one, and we kind of went through that. Oh wait, let's add, before this, let's add the bonus thing. So let's put bonuses could be used. Just as a side comment that, hey, that might be one way that the market kind of creates that. Number two would be long-term contracts. Could cause stickiness. The long-term contracts in the form of labor contract could be a private contract, but more typically would be a union contract of some sort. That very well might be 3 to 5 years, maybe even up to 7 years. And then there might be other contracts like lease and or mortgage contracts. If they do own the property, they might have bit the bullet and agreed to pay lease or mortgage payments. There could be other subcontractors. Subcontractor contracts, it's probably using the word contract too much. But you might have a relationship with a supplier that says, hey, we need a raw product here, and here's the deal, I'm going to pay you this for 5 years, I want to lock in the price, right? And so stuff like that goes on. So all of those might be some reasons why we see less flexibility, less upward movement in the resource market as opposed to the output market, where the prices on the shelves at Walmart might adjust pretty easily up and down, but the prices of resources may not. Okay, any last questions or comments there? So, what are the things that are going to shift? I'm going to write this equation as how your textbook did it, and then really the equation just shows all the shifters. So 3 shifters for aggregate supply. Oh, maybe I'll just write these up first. 1, expected inflation. Number 2 is price shocks. And these are really resource price shocks. There's an interesting article today on Russia and oil and what's going on in the world economy that I hadn't thought about until, but it kind of makes sense. So let's just put oil here. In the 1970s, the Middle East was fighting with us and quit giving us oil, and that caused long lines at the gas pumps and drove up the price of oil. And so as oil prices go up and kind of shock the system, labor might be the same, our lease payment might be the same, some other things might be the same, but all of a sudden oil prices go up, and it's an increase in the price of resources, and so that's going to be one of our things that'll move this thing upward. And what they were bringing up this morning was Russia suspects that maybe they have been increasing the supply of oil to drop world oil prices to put pressure on Putin, because Putin is a lot of their money is coming in from oil reserves in Russia, and they export that to Europe. So there's some are larger buyers than others, and so they think that possibly even the Middle Eastern countries of OPEC have been kind of in cahoots to stick it to Russia to drop world oil prices, and that's why we've seen oil prices go down. I had never thought about that being political, but it's possible. So oil with OPEC, and then the radio bit went on to say how lousy of a cartel OPEC's been over the years, because the countries really don't get along very well together, and they even fight. So the whole idea is to come to an agreement of what they're going to set the world price of oil on, but they inevitably end up cheating on the agreements, and it kind of screws it up. But they weren't so sure that maybe they didn't get something together here with sticking it to Russia. So price shocks are going to end up shooting that thing up. And then lastly is the output gap. So a persistent output gap. So the output gap is the current level of real GDP compared to potential. This is the equation for the output gap. So this equation shows, or kind of answers the question, how far away are we from potential? Potential real GDP. And really, this one kind of ties into this one. If we are currently at an output level here, so right now we're beyond our potential. And we haven't talked about the output gap yet, so let me talk about how the heck can we get beyond the potential? I thought that's what the potential was. Isn't that the max? How do we get beyond the potential? Okay. Okay, and how do we get past that? What's going on? I like to, again, kind of give my gut feeling of tying economics a little away from an equation and back to the real world. How does the economy get heated up such that it's going beyond its long-run potential?
From a agriculture standpoint, than usual, I guess.
Okay, good. What else? So some unexpected events that happened that were to the positive.
Could be business cycle related,
Okay.
where versus being like the recession, you're doing the exact opposite coming out of it.
Yeah, and the business cycle, that's kind of what we're even kind of asking is how do we ever get in a situation if this is the average trend, if this is the potential level of 3% growth of, just kind of the average of the cycle, how do we get to points where here we're above our potential at this point in time? If this is 2015 and this is output over here, at 2015, output Y1 is greater than what maybe our potential is. So it's related, but it's kind of still asking the same question. How do we get to a point where we're able to produce beyond our potential?
We borrow beyond what we have right now, possibly.
Okay, so we could do that. Think about the physical resources going on. What are workers doing? Working more, yeah. So instead of, if we think that the long run with a little bit of rest and a normal night's sleep, we might be putting in an 8 to 10 hour day on average. There are periods of time where we can push ourselves as humans to working 12-hour days or 14-hour days, right? So we can kind of be putting in overtime. We don't really believe that that's going to be maybe sustainable in the long run, or the adjustments that will take place is that wages will go up because things are good. That'll induce more people to come into the labor force. And so instead of my existing labor force of 10 people having to pick up an extra 2 hours a week and put in overtime, I hire a new person, right? So that kind of is that churning of the labor market. But for some period of time, we could be beyond potential. We could have our machines working longer hours, maybe longer than what's maybe planned to be sustainable. So we can kind of push ourselves. So when we think about this word potential, we want to think about a comfortable level of production using resources at their optimal operating levels, whether it's human beings or machines or other things. We kind of got the resource base at this optimal level. Because we know if we push a machine too hard, if we work it too many hours, too long a period of time, it breaks, right? Same thing like people break. If we push them too hard for too long a time, things break. So there's this optimal level, and that's what this mysterious potential level is. Okay, so if there's an output gap, does this put additional pressure on inflation or less pressure on inflation if we're pushing output beyond our potential?
If we're just staying on the line, then yeah, we went higher on the inflation.
Okay. Yeah, and so where does it, and so what I want to think about is where do we go from here? So yes, you're right. Somehow we got out to here, and so we're at this level of inflation. Let's just call it pi 1. What happens from here? Will there be further inflation, or will we get back in having less upward pressure on prices? And I want you to think about the story I just told too. The economy is being pushed beyond what we think its potential. Is that going to cause additional inflation, or inflation will start to adjust downward. What's happening to wages? What's happening to wages? So, Rachel, you pointed out, I think, if I'm making $20 an hour and the inflation is at its base year, just to keep things easy, so at 1.00, my real wage is $20. As inflation occurs, if inflation jumps up 4%, then my real wage falls to 1.04, whatever that number turns out to be. We don't need to calculate it, but we know that it's my real wage is going to be less. And so what type of pressure is going to be on the wages? To go up or down? To go up. In other words, nominal wages, the one up top, we're going to say, hey, you're working me to death. Don't you think I deserve a pay raise? Right? That's the sticky wage argument. So as employers, sorry, I guess I already erased it. If employers start to believe that the increase in output is going to be persistent, and there's less uncertainty with the output level, they're okay giving them a wage, right? They'll ratchet up the pay a little bit. And so maybe we will bump their pay, maybe we'll bump it the 4% to at least keep up with inflation, or if we want to reward them, then maybe we bump their pay even more than 4%. Chris?
How does that work with, because you work overtime, so you automatically get a little bit working time and a half or whatever you paid extra.
Right.
How long-term is that? Because, I mean, if it's just a couple months, you'll just continue to make overtime and not accounting for that, I guess.
Right.
As a business, wouldn't you look at, well, we're paying them overtime, so we already are adjusting their
Yes, we are. Yeah, and so that's a kind of a short-term adjustment up. But if we ultimately end up telling the story of hiring a new person on, and then those people are going to do less overtime, because the employer has less incentive to pay 1.5 times, right? If that's our normal, I mean, they can set their own pay. But we go from $20 to $30. And you're right, so in the short term, that's again one of those mechanisms that the classical economists would argue back to the Keynesians to say, hey, wages are kind of flexible. We pay time and a half. Well, that's in the upward direction, but that usually doesn't work down, but they might be cutting some of their pay. So once we hire on the new person, in order to get the new person, and there's inflation, we still had to give maybe a 4% pay. Not only to the extra person we hired, but to the previous people too.
Okay.
Yep, and so then it starts that ratcheting up process of resource prices climbing. And so that's the story that's going on here, is if, in fact, I'm going to change this back to $10 is what I like to use just because the number's so much easier. If the nominal wage is $10, I was using 20 over there, there's going to be eventually upward pressure on the wages to climb to match the inflation rate. And so this output gap tends to lead to shifts up of the aggregate supply curve. And when it starts shifting up, resource prices are starting to shift up to higher levels as well. I'm just going to put an $11 pay there. So resource price adjustment catching up with output prices, or they're starting to run together with each other, might be the way to think about it, because it's not that one staying completely frozen. But to get out to this level, telling the sticky wage theory is that, hey, I can move from what I'm doing in the long run, I can move up to point B by having the prices on the shelves at Walmart getting higher, but my resource prices are still relatively fixed. Eventually, though, that's not stable, and resource prices are going to start to adjust, and that's when we're going to get a shift up. So this persistent output gap kind of ties into this one too. These two are kind of telling a similar story. Because we have an output gap, we expect inflation, and therefore we ask for higher pay. So those tell a similar story. Whereas the price shock is just OPEC raises oil prices, boom, oil prices go up. So we could have oil equal to $100 a barrel, oil equal to $120 a barrel. Okay, any other comments there? Let me write out the equation that they do. So aggregate supply equation. Inflation equals expected inflation. I'd like to almost rewrite this differently. Plus gamma times the output gap plus rho. Inflation is a function of what we expect inflation to be in the future. This is the output gap. This is the price shock. Rho is, it's a fixed number. It's just the price shock for oil prices or whatever. It's just going to be, so from, I know you, the math people here, it's kind of coming down to a slope-intercept form type concept. Okay. So the intercept is rho and the expected inflation. Gotcha. That's just going to shift that up, whereas the gamma here is dependent on the input. And so that's our slope parameter. And that's what it's going to add. This little gamma is the slope. And these are intercepts. If we kind of just boil it down to how the simple little straight line equation would work. And then if this changes, as the slope changes, if we allow more and more flexibility of resource prices, and gamma gets bigger and bigger and bigger, then we eventually have the short run collapsing in on the long run. And so the classical economists would say there is no such thing as the short run. If we have systems in place that allow resource flexibility, then maybe they'd give you that, oh, the aggregate supply might be that steep, so gamma might be that steep, but that's basically like that or whatever. So that's the idea. That's why the author kind of set this up this way. Is it's the thing that allows them to kind of work to each other, short run and long run. Okay, let's try a little problem. Using aggregate demand and aggregate supply, show and describe the effects short run and long run of a temporary negative supply shock. And when we do this, we're going to start with what we call a long run equilibrium. So, example. Using aggregate demand, aggregate supply, show a temporary negative supply shock. So putting all three together, we will start off in a long run equilibrium. And I'll let you guys work on that. So show long run, show short run, and long run change. Scary. So it's a negative shock, so it's going to be shift the other way. And since it's temporary, it won't affect the long run. Good. Yeah, so it won't be that extra dash line. Yeah. And that's the whole language of the temporary business. So.
Question for you.
Yep.
Because
Yes. Yep.
It wasn't actually it was about the quiz.
Okay, catch me after class. I want to get around to people. All right, so if it's temporary in nature, you want to go negative, it goes the other way. So negative prices are falling, so that's all right. So the bad part is it leads to inflation. So we end up getting a negative supply shock, price of oil goes up. So we go to AS1, that gives us, so the things to note here is that we do get a drop in output. So we have a negative output gap, upward pressure on inflation compared to where we started. We could characterize this as a recession. Possibly. A recession is technically a 2-quarter decline in real GDP, so it's not necessarily a recession, but you can kind of think that way. Things aren't so hot here. Over time, there's going to be resource price adjustment back down if it's temporary. All right. If it was permanent, we'd have the long run aggregate supply shifting too. So if you come into questions that kind of talk permanent or temporary, that's part of what they're getting at. So you could kind of do a little part B. What if permanent negative supply shock. So since we're talking about supply, it's long run aggregate supply. And our potential would be changing. Now, as this thing moves, so does the aggregate supply curve. These two things shift parallel the same distance. So I took this original equilibrium point and I came the same distance that I did with the long run aggregate supply. Right. So that's when we see a permanent shift and it involves long run. Basically, anything that shifts the long run curve shifts the short run curve too. And so we're just holding it at that original inflation to get the initial adjustment. That's right. So the next thing is, where do we go from here with aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is staying constant. And so now we've got aggregate demand intersecting a new long run position. All right, so the short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect here. I need to get a new color in here. The new short run aggregate supply, the old aggregate demand curve is here. And now we have a positive output gap, which is going to put further pressure on aggregate supply shifting up. Where we're always headed in the long run is kind of a key thing to eyeball, is where the aggregate demand curve intersects the long run aggregate supply curve. So let me add that key. Where we are headed is where aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply intersect. And so there's going to be further upward pressure in inflation to get to a new long run equilibrium. The economy kind of sucks here. High inflation, falling GDP. And this would be our final resting point. Okay, let's call it a day there. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, since you're reopening the test, are you also reopening the quiz?
Yeah, I don't mind doing that.